In the spring of 1884, the most exclusive financial institution in New York City collapsed overnight, taking with it the fortunes of America's most prominent families. The Astors lost millions. The Vanderbilts saw their carefully cultivated investments evaporate. Even former President Ulysses S. Grant found himself facing bankruptcy and public humiliation. But the man responsible for this catastrophe wasn't a foreign enemy or natural disaster. He was a charming 31-year-old banker whom New York society had embraced as their financial savior. Ferdinand Ward had accomplished something that seemed impossible in the rigid hierarchy of Gilded Age Manhattan. Rising from complete obscurity, he had convinced the most sophisticated financiers in America to trust him with their most precious asset, their money. For 3 years, Ward's investment firm generated returns so spectacular that clients fought for the privilege of giving him their fortunes. The newspapers called him the young Napoleon of finance. Society hostesses competed to have him at their dinner parties. Even the shrewdest businessmen of the era believed they had discovered the investment genius of the century. The official records describe Ward's downfall as a simple case of financial overreach and market speculation gone wrong. But recently uncovered correspondence hidden in a Swiss bank vault tells a far more extraordinary story, one that reveals how a master manipulator used the greed and arrogance of America's elite against them in the most sophisticated confidence scheme ever devised, a scheme so brilliant that its victims continued to defend Ward even after he had stolen everything they owned. Before we dive into the incredible story of how Ferdinand Ward orchestrated the greatest financial deception in American history, take a moment to subscribe and let us know in the comments which aspect of Gilded Age corruption interests you most. We love connecting with fellow history enthusiasts who appreciate the darker side of America's golden era. The truth about Ferdinand Ward begins not with his rise to power, but with the carefully constructed fiction he created about his own background to gain entry into New York's impenetrable social fortress. New York in 1880 was a city where bloodlines mattered more than talent, where old money looked down upon new wealth, and where social acceptance could take generations to achieve. Into this world stepped a young man who possessed nothing but ambition and an almost supernatural ability to tell people exactly what they wanted to hear. Ferdinand Ward arrived in Manhattan claiming to be the son of a successful Pennsylvania grain merchant who had made his fortune supplying Union forces during the Civil War. The story was compelling because it was partially true. Ward's father had indeed been involved in grain trading, but the family business had collapsed into bankruptcy when Ferdinand was barely 16, leaving the family destitute and desperate. What New York society didn't know was that Ferdinand had spent his teenage years learning the art of deception from some of the most skilled confidence men in America. After his family's financial ruin, he had fallen in with a group of sophisticated swindlers who operated throughout the Midwest, targeting wealthy farmers and small-town businessmen with elaborate investment schemes. Under their tutelage, Ferdinand mastered the psychology of greed and the techniques of gaining trust through fabricated success. By the time he reached New York, Ferdinand Ward had transformed himself into the perfect reflection of what Gilded Age society expected from a successful young financier. His clothes were impeccably tailored but not ostentatious. His manner was confident but respectful of social hierarchy. His knowledge of finance was comprehensive enough to impress even experienced bankers, yet he always deferred to the wisdom of his elders in ways that flattered their egos. Ferdinand's entry into New York society came through a carefully orchestrated campaign that demonstrated his genius for psychological manipulation. Rather than attempting to force his way into established social circles, he positioned himself where influential people would discover him naturally. He began attending Trinity Church, where many of the city's oldest families worshipped, presenting himself as a devout young man seeking spiritual guidance as well as business opportunities. It was at Trinity Church that Ferdinand first encountered James Fish, president of the Marine National Bank and one of Wall Street's most respected figures. Fish was immediately impressed by the young man's apparent combination of religious devotion and financial acumen. When Ferdinand modestly mentioned his success in modest grain trading ventures, Fish was intrigued enough to invite him for lunch at the Union Club. That lunch meeting marked the beginning of Ferdinand's systematic infiltration of New York's financial elite. His strategy was masterful in its simplicity. Instead of making grandiose claims about his abilities, he spoke humbly about small successes while demonstrating an encyclopedic knowledge of market conditions that impressed seasoned professionals. He asked thoughtful questions that showed respect for his companion's experience while subtly suggesting investment opportunities they hadn't considered. Within 6 months, Ferdinand had established himself as a regular presence at the city's most exclusive financial gatherings. His reputation grew through carefully cultivated word-of-mouth recommendations from men who believed they had discovered an exceptional talent. Each successful social interaction led to invitations to more prestigious events, creating a snowball effect that rapidly elevated Ferdinand's status. The genius of Ferdinand's approach lay in how he made each member of New York's elite feel uniquely special and intelligent. He never approached them as a supplicant seeking favors. Instead, he positioned himself as a promising young talent who was fortunate enough to learn from their wisdom. This flattery was so subtle and perfectly calibrated that even the most cynical businessmen found themselves warming to his apparent sincerity. Ferdinand's big breakthrough came when he was introduced to Ulysses S. Grant, Jr., son of the former president and a man desperate to establish his own reputation independent of his father's fame. Grant, Jr. had been struggling to find investment opportunities that would generate the kind of spectacular returns necessary to create his own financial empire. When Ferdinand proposed a partnership that would give Grant Jr. equal billing in a new investment firm, the young man was immediately captivated. Grant & Ward was established in January 1881 with great fanfare and the implicit endorsement of one of America's most famous names. The firm's initial capitalization came from Ferdinand's supposed profits from grain trading and Grant Jr.'s family connections, but in reality, the money came from a much more sinister source. Ferdinand had spent months studying the financial habits and psychological weaknesses of New York's wealthiest families. He knew that the Astors prided themselves on their conservative investment strategies, but secretly envied the spectacular gains that more aggressive investors sometimes achieved. He understood that the Vanderbilts were constantly seeking new opportunities to expand their transportation empire. Most importantly, he recognized that all of these families shared a common vulnerability. Their arrogance made them believe they were too sophisticated to be deceived. The investment returns that Grant & Ward promised seemed too good to be true, but Ferdinand's presentation made them appear not only achievable, but inevitable. He claimed to have developed a revolutionary system for predicting railroad stock movements through advanced knowledge of government contract awards. His supposed connections with military procurement officers allegedly gave him inside information about which shipping companies would receive lucrative government deals. The beauty of Ferdinand's scheme was that the initial returns were genuine, paid for by money from new investors rather than actual profits. This classic Ponzi structure was disguised through such sophisticated bookkeeping that even experienced accountants couldn't detect the fraud. Ferdinand hired the most respected accounting firm in the city to prepare Grant & Ward's financial statements, ensuring that the numbers appeared legitimate to even skeptical investors. Caroline Astor, the undisputed queen of New York society, became Ferdinand's most valuable advocate after he generated a 47% return on her initial investment of $50,000. Her endorsement opened doors that no amount of charm or talent could have unlocked. When Mrs. Astor spoke approvingly of a financial opportunity, every ambitious social climber in the city paid attention. The Vanderbilt family's involvement came through Cornelius Vanderbilt II, who was impressed by Ferdinand's apparent understanding of railroad economics. Ferdinand had done extensive research into the Vanderbilt transportation network and was able to discuss operational challenges and opportunities with an expertise that convinced Cornelius he had found a kindred spirit in business. What made Ferdinand's scheme so successful was his understanding that wealthy people were often desperate for investment opportunities that would maintain their social status without requiring them to engage in the vulgar activities of actual business management. Grant and Ward offered them the perfect solution: spectacular returns with no effort required beyond writing checks. Ferdinand's social ascent accelerated dramatically as his client list grew to include virtually every major family in New York. He was invited to the most exclusive dinner parties, joined the Union Club and the Brook Club, and even began courting Margaret Greene, daughter of a wealthy shipping magnate whose family traced their American lineage back to the Mayflower. The young man who had arrived in New York with nothing was now positioned to marry into genuine aristocracy. But beneath the surface of Ferdinand's spectacular success, cracks were beginning to appear in his elaborate facade. The mathematical reality of his Ponzi scheme meant that he needed ever-increasing amounts of new investment to pay the promised returns to existing clients. By 1883, Grant and Ward required nearly $200,000 in new money each month just to maintain the illusion of profitability. Ferdinand's solution to this growing crisis demonstrated both his criminal genius and his fundamental misconception about the nature of wealth and power in America. Instead of limiting his scheme or attempting a graceful exit, he decided to accelerate his operations by targeting the largest possible investments from the most prestigious clients. His reasoning was that a few massive scores would solve his financial problems while simultaneously elevating his social status to unassailable heights. The plan that Ferdinand developed for his final offensive against New York's elite was breathtaking in its audacity. He would simultaneously approach the Astor family, the Vanderbilts, and even former President Grant himself with investment opportunities so spectacular that they would commit their entire liquid wealth to his management. These investments would be presented as once-in-a-lifetime opportunities to purchase government contracts and railroad concessions at insider prices. Ferdinand's preparation for this ultimate deception involved months of elaborate stagecraft. He rented offices in the city's most prestigious financial district and hired actors to pose as government officials and railroad executives. He created fake documents that appeared to confirm his claims about upcoming contract awards and produced forged letters of credit from European banks. Most brilliantly, Ferdinand arranged for several legitimate small-scale successes that appeared to validate his claims about insider knowledge. Through careful market manipulation and strategic timing, he generated genuine profits on minor investments that convinced his targets that his larger promises were equally reliable. The psychological impact of these preliminary successes made his eventual victims eager to increase their stakes rather than question his methods. The spring of 1884 marked the climax of Ferdinand's campaign against New York's financial elite. In a series of meetings that would later be recognized as masterpieces of psychological manipulation, he convinced his most prominent clients to make the investments that would either secure his future or destroy him completely. His meeting with Caroline Astor took place in the elegant drawing room of her Fifth Avenue mansion, surrounded by priceless artwork and furnishings that represented centuries of accumulated wealth. Ferdinand presented her with an opportunity to purchase exclusive rights to supply the U.S. Navy with steel plating for their new warship construction program. The investment required $500,000, but promised returns of over 200% within 6 months, as the government desperately needed reliable suppliers for their naval expansion. Mrs. Astor's decision to commit such an enormous sum wasn't based solely on Ferdinand's financial projections. She had become genuinely fond of the young man, whom she viewed as representing the best qualities of American entrepreneurship. Her investment was as much a personal endorsement as a business decision, and Ferdinand understood that her support would influence dozens of other potential investors. The Vanderbilt family meeting required different tactics, as Cornelius Vanderbilt II was far more skeptical and business-focused than the socially oriented Mrs. Astor. Ferdinand presented him with detailed plans for purchasing controlling interests in 3 major railroad lines that were facing temporary financial difficulties. The purchase price was $750,000. But the acquisition would give the Vanderbilts virtual monopoly control over freight transportation throughout the Northeast. Ferdinand's presentation included forged financial statements from the target railroads, fake correspondence with government officials discussing upcoming infrastructure projects, and even carefully staged meetings with supposed railroad executives who were actually actors hired to play their roles. The level of detail and apparent authenticity convinced Vanderbilt that he was looking at the deal of a lifetime. But Ferdinand's most audacious target was former President Ulysses S. Grant himself. Grant's son had been Ferdinand's business partner from the beginning, providing the family name that had opened doors throughout New York society. Now Ferdinand approached the former president with an investment opportunity that seemed perfectly suited to Grant's interests and reputation. The proposal involved purchasing government surplus military equipment and reselling it to foreign governments who were modernizing their armies. Ferdinand claimed to have exclusive contracts with buyers in South America and Asia who were willing to pay premium prices for American military technology. The investment required $600,000, but promised to double Grant's money within 4 months, while also serving American diplomatic interests by strengthening friendly foreign governments. Grant's decision to invest was influenced by more than financial considerations. The former president had been struggling with business ventures since leaving office, and several failed investments had damaged both his wealth and his reputation. Ferdinand's proposal offered not just financial recovery, but a way to contribute to American foreign policy objectives through private enterprise. The total amount that Ferdinand collected during his final campaign exceeded $8 million, a sum that would be equivalent to over $50 million today. For several weeks, Ferdinand lived like a king, investing portions of the money in legitimate enterprises to maintain the illusion of activity while transferring the majority to accounts he controlled under false names. But Ferdinand had made a critical miscalculation about the nature of power in Gilded Age America. He had assumed that the wealth and social status he had achieved would protect him from investigation and legal consequences. He failed to understand that his victims weren't just wealthy individuals. They were members of an interconnected network of power that controlled not just money, but also law enforcement, media, and political institutions. The first sign that Ferdinand's world was about to collapse came when James Fish began asking detailed questions about the naval contracts that were supposedly generating Mrs. Astor's spectacular returns. Fish's banking connections allowed him to verify information that other investors had simply taken on faith, and what he discovered set off alarms throughout the city's financial community. The naval procurement officers that Ferdinand claimed to be working with not only denied any involvement in private contracting deals, but revealed that all major naval purchases were handled through public bidding processes that left no room for the kind of insider arrangements Ferdinand had described. Fish's investigation quickly expanded to include the railroad investments and military surplus deals, revealing that virtually every aspect of Ferdinand's business was fraudulent. The speed with which Ferdinand's empire collapsed demonstrated the power of the network he had deceived. Within 48 hours of Fish's initial inquiries, investigations were underway by the city's most prominent law firms. The mayor's office had frozen Grant and Ward's bank accounts, and newspaper editors were preparing exposés that would destroy Ferdinand's reputation forever. Ferdinand's arrest on May 4, 1884, created a sensation that dominated newspaper headlines for months. The young man, who had been welcomed into the most exclusive drawing rooms in America, was now revealed as what the newspapers called the most audacious swindler in the history of American finance. The scope of his deception shocked even the cynical reporters who covered Wall Street's frequent scandals. But the most remarkable aspect of Ferdinand Ward's story wasn't his criminal success. It was the reaction of his victims. Rather than simply accepting that they had been deceived, many of New York's elite initially refused to believe that Ferdinand was a conscious criminal. They convinced themselves that he was a misguided but essentially honest young man who had simply gotten in over his head with investments that had unfortunately failed. This psychological denial revealed something profound about the mentality of America's upper class during the Gilded Age. These were people who had built their fortunes through ruthless business practices and sophisticated financial manipulation. The idea that a small-town nobody could outwit them using their own methods was so threatening to their self-image that they preferred to believe in Ferdinand's innocence rather than acknowledge their own gullibility. Caroline Astor's response was particularly revealing. Even after the fraud was fully exposed, she continued to describe Ferdinand as a promising young man who simply lacked the experience to handle such large responsibilities. She suggested that rather than prosecution, Ferdinand should be given the opportunity to work off his debts under the supervision of more experienced financiers. Her inability to accept that she had been completely fooled by a confidence man demonstrated the psychological blindness that had made Ferdinand's scheme possible in the first place. The Vanderbilt family's reaction was more pragmatic, but equally telling. Rather than seeking maximum punishment for Ferdinand, they focused their efforts on recovering their losses through legal action against the banks and accounting firms that had verified Ferdinand's fraudulent documents. Their approach suggested that they viewed Ferdinand as merely a tool used by more sophisticated criminals rather than the mastermind of his own operation. Former President Grant's response was perhaps the most tragic. The revelation that his son's business partner was a criminal devastated the old soldier who had survived civil war, political scandals, and personal financial disasters. Grant's public statement supporting Ferdinand, "I believe young Ward to be fundamentally honest, though perhaps guilty of poor judgment," revealed how completely Ferdinand had manipulated even America's greatest military hero. The trial of Ferdinand Ward became a sensation that rivaled the greatest entertainment spectacles of the era. The prosecution presented evidence of fraud so extensive and systematic that it seemed almost impossible for one person to have orchestrated. They revealed that Ferdinand had created dozens of fake companies, forged signatures of government officials, and fabricated entire investment opportunities that existed only on paper. But Ferdinand's defense strategy was as brilliant as his original scheme. Rather than denying the fraud, he claimed to have been the victim of a conspiracy orchestrated by European financial interests who had used him as a front for their attacks on American wealth. He suggested that his apparent sophistication in financial matters actually came from foreign handlers who had coached him in the techniques necessary to penetrate American society. This defense was psychologically genius because it allowed Ferdinand's victims to maintain their dignity while explaining how they had been deceived. They hadn't been fooled by a common criminal. They had been targeted by an international conspiracy that used Ferdinand as a weapon against American interests. The narrative transformed Ferdinand from a master manipulator into a puppet, his victims from fools into patriots who had been attacked by foreign enemies. Ferdinand's ability to maintain sympathy even from those he had robbed demonstrated his understanding of human psychology that went far beyond simple criminal cunning. He had recognized that wealthy people would rather believe in elaborate conspiracies than admit they had been outsmarted by someone they considered their social inferior. By providing them with an explanation that preserved their self-respect, Ferdinand actually strengthened the psychological bonds that had made his original deception possible. The evidence presented during Ferdinand's trial revealed the extraordinary sophistication of his operation. He had maintained detailed psychological profiles of all his major clients, tracking their personal interests, family relationships, political opinions, and financial anxieties. These profiles allowed him to customize his approach to each victim, appealing to their specific desires and fears in ways that made his proposals irresistible. For Carolyn Astor, Ferdinand had emphasized how his investment opportunities would generate profits that could be used for the charitable works that were her primary source of social prestige. For the Vanderbilts, he had focused on how his railroad investments would complement their existing transportation empire. For President Grant, he had stressed the patriotic aspects of his military surplus scheme and how it would serve American diplomatic objectives. But perhaps most remarkably, Ferdinand had also created elaborate contingency plans for maintaining his clients' loyalty even after his scheme was exposed. He had prepared documents that could be discovered, which would shift blame to supposed European co-conspirators. He had arranged for character witnesses who would testify to his essential honesty and good intentions. He had even planned a defense strategy that would transform his trial from a simple fraud case into a complex international intrigue. The depth of Ferdinand's psychological manipulation became clear when investigators discovered that he had been secretly recording conversations with his clients using a primitive mechanical device hidden in his office. These recordings revealed how skillfully Ferdinand had exploited his victims' psychological weaknesses, playing on their greed, their social insecurities, and their desire to believe they were smarter than everyone else. Most disturbingly, the recordings showed that Ferdinand had genuine contempt for the people whose money he was stealing. In private conversations with his confederates, he described his clients as overfed parasites and hereditary idiots who deserved to be relieved of wealth they had done nothing to earn. His public charm and apparent respect were entirely calculated performances designed to extract maximum financial benefit from people he genuinely despised. But the investigation also revealed that Ferdinand's scheme had achieved something that went beyond simple financial crime. By exposing the gullibility and arrogance of America's elite, he had inadvertently performed a kind of social experiment that revealed uncomfortable truths about the nature of inherited wealth and social privilege in the Gilded Age. The speed with which New York's most sophisticated financiers had been deceived demonstrated that their success was based more on inheritance and social connections than on genuine financial expertise. Their willingness to invest enormous sums without adequate due diligence showed that they had become so isolated from economic reality that they couldn't recognize obvious fraud even when it was presented to them directly. Ferdinand's sentencing on November 15, 1884, marked the end of one of the most spectacular criminal careers in American history. Judge Morrison sentenced him to 10 years in Sing Sing prison, describing his crimes as a betrayal of trust so complete and systematic that it strikes at the very foundations of commercial confidence that make civilization possible. But even as Ferdinand was led away in chains, many of his victims continued to express admiration for his talents and regret that his abilities hadn't been channeled into legitimate enterprises. Caroline Astor visited him in prison and continued to send him books and small gifts throughout his incarceration. The Vanderbilt family established a legal fund to ensure he received competent representation during his appeals. Most remarkably, former President Grant wrote several letters to Ferdinand during his imprisonment, expressing forgiveness and encouraging him to use his time in prison to prepare for a legitimate business career after his release. Grant's continued support for the man who had financially ruined him demonstrated the psychological power that Ferdinand had exercised over his victims even after his crimes were fully exposed. Ferdinand Ward served only 6 years of his sentence before being released for good behavior in 1890. But rather than attempting to rebuild his life quietly, he chose to write and publish his memoirs, Confessions of a Wall Street Swindler, which became a bestseller and made him briefly famous all over again. The book revealed details about his scheme that hadn't emerged during his trial and provided insights into the psychology of confidence artistry that fascinated both criminals and law enforcement. In his memoirs, Ferdinand explained his philosophy of deception with startling honesty. He described how he had studied his victims like a scientist studying laboratory specimens, identifying their psychological weaknesses and exploiting them with scientific precision. He revealed that he had never felt guilt about his crimes because he believed his victims were essentially stealing from society through their inherited privileges and unearned advantages. Most provocatively, Ferdinand argued that his scheme had performed a valuable social service by redistributing wealth from idle inheritors to people who would use it more productively. He claimed that the money he had stolen had supported dozens of families and small businesses that provided genuine value to society, unlike the passive investments that had made his victims wealthy without requiring any actual work or creativity. Ferdinand's post-prison career was almost as remarkable as his criminal activities. Using the notoriety generated by his memoirs, he established himself as a lecturer who spoke to business groups and universities about the psychology of fraud and the importance of due diligence in investment decisions. His presentations were popular because he could provide insights into criminal thinking that no legitimate expert could match. But Ferdinand's most lasting impact came through his influence on the victims whose lives he had changed forever. The exposure of their gullibility had forced New York's elite to confront uncomfortable truths about their own competence and the sources of their wealth. Many responded by becoming more involved in the actual management of their investments, developing financial expertise that their inherited positions had never required them to acquire. Caroline Astor used her experience with Ferdinand to become one of the most sophisticated female investors of her era, personally managing a portfolio that eventually recovered all of her losses and generated substantial additional wealth. Her transformation from passive inheritor to active financier inspired other women in her social circle to take greater control over their economic affairs. The Vanderbilt family restructured their business operations to include more rigorous oversight and verification procedures that prevented future deceptions. Their experience with Ferdinand led them to develop some of the first systematic approaches to investment due diligence that would later become standard practice throughout American finance. Even President Grant, despite the personal humiliation Ferdinand had caused him, credited the experience with teaching him valuable lessons about business that he had never learned during his military and political careers. Grant's final assessment of Ferdinand was remarkably philosophical. The young man taught me more about finance through his deceptions than I had learned through decades of honest dealings. Ferdinand Ward's story reveals how the same psychological techniques that enabled his criminal success also created lasting changes in American financial culture. His victims' determination to understand how they had been deceived led to innovations in investment analysis, corporate governance, and fraud detection that strengthened the entire financial system. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Ferdinand's legacy was how his story became a cautionary tale that influenced American attitudes toward wealth and social privilege for generations. The ease with which a small-town nobody had penetrated and exploited New York's most exclusive society forced Americans to question whether inherited wealth automatically conferred wisdom or competence. Ferdinand Ward died in 1906, 22 years after his downfall, having spent his later years as a moderately successful legitimate businessman who used his notoriety to build a consulting practice that advised wealthy families on protecting themselves from financial fraud. The irony of Ferdinand advising people on how to avoid being swindled was not lost on those who remembered his criminal career. His funeral was attended by several of his former victims, including members of the Astor family who had maintained correspondence with him throughout his later years. Their presence at his burial demonstrated the complex relationship between Ferdinand and the people whose lives he had forever changed. He had been their destroyer, but also, in a strange way, their teacher and the catalyst for their personal growth. The story of Ferdinand Ward serves as a fascinating window into the psychology of both criminal deception and elite vulnerability during America's Gilded Age. His success revealed how isolation from economic reality could make even sophisticated people susceptible to obvious fraud, while his ultimate failure demonstrated that social privilege, however powerful, could not protect criminals from the consequences of their actions. Ferdinand's tale reminds us that the most dangerous criminals are often those who understand human psychology better than their victims understand themselves. His ability to exploit the specific psychological weaknesses of America's elite shows how criminal genius often succeeds not through superior resources or connections, but through superior understanding of human nature. Most importantly, Ferdinand Ward's story illustrates how financial crime can sometimes serve as an unintended catalyst for positive change. His victims' determination to understand how they had been deceived led to innovations in financial oversight and investment analysis that protected countless future investors from similar schemes. What do you think about Ferdinand Ward's complex legacy? Was he simply a criminal who got lucky, or was he a criminal genius who exposed important weaknesses in America's financial system? Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know which aspect of his story you found most fascinating. If you enjoyed this tale of financial deception and want more stories about the hidden scandals of America's Gilded Age, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates the darker side of American history. Until next time, remember that the most brilliant criminals are often indistinguishable from the most brilliant legitimate businessmen until it's too late to matter.